Hey Mac, how you doing? Uh, I thought it'd be easier maybe if I just make a quick short video. To be honest with you, I really didn't feel like typing. I've been typing all week, and I still got a ton of stuff to type before the weekend's up. Um, so I was hoping I could um, just just give you a few, just give a little bit of context, or little bit more contextual understanding to the view that the article is trying to demonstrate. I think because the the article is written very tacitly, and it seems to make the assumption that the reader knows or has some type of background understanding of what some of these things mean, like when it talks about egoism or utilitarianism, Ayn Rand's philosophy, and so on or whatever. And I thought maybe if I can, if this helps at all, I hope it does. It gives just a little bit of a healthier view to give some type of understanding. The article itself was very interesting. I think people when they hear Ayn Rand, or let's just say they post quotes of Ayn Rand on any social media, it's always done seemingly in a very pejorative sense. And I think that's because people really don't understand Ayn Rand in the sense that she's meant to be understood. And I think a lot of that is because the common understanding of Ayn Rand is derived from her novels. Okay, and not too many people, it seems anyway, do too much reading on her actual philosophy of, let's just say, objective epistemology. And if you really look at her economics, it derives out of her philosophy and not the other way around. Her philosophy is very Aristotelian. To understand Ayn Rand, you have to understand Aristotle to at least some extent or to some degree to kind of make sense of it all. One of the things I'd first like to address before I even get into the whole thing about capitalism and so on is the thought, or let's just say the concept, the philosophical concept of utilitarianism. Okay, basically, much of this article is based off on what's called consequentialist theory, and there's two aspects. It breaks down into two aspects, which is utilitarian philosophy or principles and egoism. And I would even add that there's a third element which binds with utilitarian principles or philosophy, which is psychological egoism. Actually, excuse me, it binds a little bit better with egoism, which is psychological egoism. So let me try to, if I can, just start a little bit from the beginning. Utilitarian philosophy is basically the principles that were established by Bentham, John Stuart Mill, and so on, which is the foundational ideology of the modern state. This is where we have the basis, the foundation of our social system, which for the most part is mostly socially democratic. So from that understanding, this is what set up even more or less the principles of the welfare state, developed by you maybe even want to do some reading on the Beveridge report. I think his name was, if I, off the top of my head, I think it was Richard Beveridge, who came up with the idea of the welfare state. And when people hear the word welfare, they think about the word welfare in the worst possible sense. And the word welfare is a very, very broad term. It means a lot of different things, and there's a lot of different people that benefit from welfare. For example, on one end of the spectrum, you have, when people think of welfare, they think of the guy sitting at home on his couch collecting food stamps, but they never think about, corporations that receive subsidies or whatever. Basically, that's a form of welfare. So let me start with utilitarian principles, just kind of in a very short nutshell. The utilitarian, one of the definitions, or the more prominent definitions for utilitarianism, is very easy to understand. It's the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So whatever that is, whatever it is that produces the greatest amount of good, it's supposed to be what should be better for the greatest amount of people, which which is more conducive to what's called the greater good. There are some arguments against utilitarian principles. One of the most salient arguments is that utilitarian principles or philosophy doesn't account for the individual needs and wants of individuals. So that's just like if we're in a room full of people and we decide collectively that we're going to all have tuna fish for the next 100 years or whatever, and after 3 months of choking down tuna fish, I get up and say, hey, I'll be right back. And I come back with a steak, and everybody's upset with me because I have a steak. And I say, well, don't ask for any of my steak because you guys wanted tuna fish. But I didn't want tuna fish. But, I seem to be conscripted into this deal of having tuna fish. I want a steak, you guys wanted tuna. I seem to be conscripted into this idea of having tuna fish, but that's not what I really wanted. I should be free to pursue my own separate interest. So when Ayn Rand talks about selfishness, she's not talking about selfishness in the sense of I don't give a crap about anybody else. She's talking about individuals pursuing their own separate interest. Okay, and this idea of altruism. She believed that, the idea of altruism is you become more of a sacrificial animal for everybody else, and it negates the idea of the individual itself, him or herself. She believed in this whole idea of individualism, as she would call it. And everybody should be free to pursue their own separate interests. So let me see if I could pick out a few things in the article. I think the first part of it says something about Ayn Rand was one of those things a lot of us when we were 17 and 18 and feeling misunderstood, we pick up then once we got older and so on or whatever. Yeah, I can understand how people would understand that, but or see it that way, but I don't think they would fully. They don't seem. I think they just stopped short there without actually delving into her philosophy itself. Even the people who are fans of Ayn Rand or fans of this type of philosophical or even economic thought, you actually have to read her understanding of objectivist epistemology, and then her economics will actually start to make sense. So this kind of transverses into this whole thing of egoism, which was supposed to be my next part, apart from utilitarian principles. Egoism is just people doing what's in their best interest. And there's two types of egoism. There's personal egoism and impersonal egoism. Personal egoism is where I'm going to do what's in my best interest, and that's for me to decide. And impersonal egoism is that I think everybody else should be egoists too. Everybody else should contribute to their own self-interest. And one of the good things about egoism is that it does set up the foundations for moral incentives without having some type of understanding of what's called first order ethics, which could be based off people like Kant or Plato and so on or whatever. This is why now we have the understanding of meta ethics, which is where we place judgments and reasons on behind the decisions we make, rather than just based off some type of imperative like something that Kant would have. The second part of the article talks about rational human beings. Actually, believe it or not, capitalism itself, and let me make the distinction, there's a difference between capitalism and state capitalism. Okay, people seem to conflate these two understandings. They're not the same thing. First off, there's never been a capitalist country, a purely capitalist society in the world. The closest America has ever come to any type of capitalist system is coming out of the colonial age, and that ended, or I would say, really around the Great Depression, when we had all these ABC agencies that came out of the FDR administration due to the Great Depression and so on or whatever. But capitalism itself has derived from traditional societies. You could probably read people like Emil Durkheim and all the way up to Max Weber would talk about how capitalism is actually a rational system. And state capitalism is a little bit different than capitalism. Capitalism is just more of a free economy, which is it divorces economics and politics that are coming from, let's just say, from the government. State capitalism has a lot of influence from the government itself, and that's the model that we operate under today. It's not what people think. This is not a capitalist society. This society wouldn't last a week under an actual capitalist system. And I understand in everyday conversation that people use the word capitalism equivocally or interchangeably with state capitalism. But I think in the background, they really don't understand that these are really two different concepts. They're very dynamic. They're not static. It's just like the word socialism. Socialism is not a static term. It's a very dynamic term. Like when someone says to me, well, such and such or so and so is a socialist. Well, I have to ask, well, what kind of socialists? Are they Leninists, Marxists, reactionary socialism, bourgeoisie socialism, and so on. These aren't very static terms, but capitalism, believe it or not, is actually a very rational system. To understand this type of rationale, I can just refer you to maybe like two people I mentioned earlier, Emil Durkheim, and particularly Max Weber. So Ayn Rand, it says something about Ayn Rand's answer to that question is fundamentally different. Her answer is that as a rational human being, as a man and not an unthinking animal, you have to choose a path of freedom and individualism. So basically what Ayn Rand is talking about is just a little bit of what I mentioned earlier about egoism. You're working in your own self-interest. It doesn't mean screw everybody else. It has no connotation to that at all, but people seem to make that the connotation to it, and it's really not the same thing. I only recommend trying to read a little bit deeper into Ayn Rand. Of course, I'm trying to keep this video short as possible. So there's going to be a few things that I'll reference for you to read, other than giving like a full-blown hour-long lecture on anything like that. Also, just looking at the article very briefly here. Let me see. Let me see. There are multiple fallacies in the view. First of all, free capitalism has not been experienced by many people alive today, and that's pretty much true. The strange hybrid of Western societies today allows only limited capitalism to create enough wealth to support a wider range of political and social ambitions, which is pretty much true. This lends into what I mentioned earlier about state capitalism versus, let's just say, laissez-faire capitalism, which is free market capitalism. And but it does finish with saying, socialism doesn't work. Well, I do take some issue with that. It really depends on what kind of socialism you're talking about. Let's just say democratic socialism. I mean, we could just look at Europe and look at the democratically socialist countries that operate just fine there, or even to the north of us, Canada. They have a socially democratic system that works very well. In fact, they have the new middle class. But America itself is largely socially democratic. It is a socialist system. And structurally, what I mean by that is anytime a government has the ability to control a money supply as to where it can take money from one entity and give it to another, by definition, that is socialism. So this kind of goes back to this understanding, these definitions of what these things actually mean, whether it's socialism, what type of socialism, capitalism, what kind of capitalism, and so on, and how much government has an influence in the operation of socialism or capitalism. I will not say that socialism doesn't work. It really comes down to what type of society that people agree on collectively. What kind of society do you want to live in? What are you willing to give up, and what are you willing to accept? So we don't live in what's called traditional society anymore. We live in more, let's say, law or sociology of law. They would call it a legal rational society, which is basically a contract society. So a contract society is when you exchange rights. You exchange, you give up the ability, let's just say, to be, create all-purpose mayhem, be a jerk, and so on or whatever. And in return, you get a series of rights like, freedom, equal protection under the law, which is called autonomy, right to property, and the right to pursue your own separate interests, which is egoism. Okay, which people are misunderstanding between this idea that they believe Ayn Rand has of selfishness, that screw everybody else, and that's just not the case. The article goes on to mention something about a U.S. president saying that it's wrong to consider entire project development ourselves as more important instead of social obligations rather than disturbing it. And said something about Europe is spreading rapidly to the United States. Well, that could be argued. I wouldn't say in particularly what politician you should read. I would say what economist you would read. And I'm not advocating for any one of them. I'm just saying, you can read somebody, let's say like Joseph Stiglitz, maybe that's a little bit more on the left, and somebody like Milton Friedman, which is somebody a little bit more to the right, and they'll give some a little bit more color, a little bit more hue to the context of those views from both sides, both opposing sides, because there's some things that economics can't do, which are political, but there's a lot of things politics can't do is where economics comes in. Also, the article talks about, let me see, something about, I guess, after reading, I'm just reviewing it one more time. He's something about a CEO in a company called Saxo Bank, an international investment and trading bank, with 25 offices or offices in 25 countries and headquarters in socialist Denmark and so on. All right, this idea that capitalism brings people together regardless of their differences, that is true. But I still would say that you can't account for human nature. There's some ideas or some positions or social positions that people have that for whatever reason that they don't learn from or just won't die. Like for instance, racism. A lot of people will. They may not like somebody because of their skin color, but they will do business with them. But then again, at the same time, you'll have people that just don't want to do business with people of different races altogether. But the understanding behind the original position of that is that, well, I'm going to make money regardless of what's going to happen. And that may or may not be true. And there's so many other variables that depends on. So it's really hard to say that is true. And we can refer back to, let's just say, the 1920s, 1930s, actually the Jim Crow era. Okay, look how businesses operated in the black community, how businesses operated in the white community. And then once segregation happened, I believe I want to say like 54 and so on. Actually, 64. 54 to 64. 54, I believe, was the segregation of schools. 64 was in the Jim Crow era. And we would have to do some type of quantitative or even qualitative analysis of how the interactions or how businesses operated thereafter. What was the demographic of people that were buying certain products and so on or whatever. I'll leave that to you. Also, let me see, it goes on to say that the good thing about capitalism is it brings people together. Okay, I just addressed that. That's true to a point. I'll further that point just a little bit more. It does bring people together because, there are certain things that people can't do on their own. And there's two options. You can collaborate with other people, regardless of what color they are, if they have something to offer and bring to the table, as long as you both are benefiting mutually. And the government, believe it or not, the government does play a role in helping people or groups of people accomplish things that they could not accomplish separately. So overall, I think what the author of this article is really getting at is that capitalism is the dominant, or should be the dominant system and so on or whatever. And I don't particularly accept that view entirely. I consider myself a capitalist only in the sense that this is the system that I have to operate under if I want to be successful. Does that mean that I believe it should be the only dominant system in the world? No, I don't. Okay, and over the years there have been many disputes or even revolts against capitalism. You need only go back to just as recent as the 19th century. If you read, let's just say, Seth Rockman's book "Scraping By," Walter Johnson's book "Soul by Soul," which has a lot to do with the slave trade and also has a lot to do with the rise of the rise in the industrial age of factories and textile mills and so on or whatever. There's always been disputes against capitalism, even wage disputes. In fact, you see it today. People will also make the argument to say, oh, well, capitalism has increased the standard of living for people. That's true only to an extent. But that's just like me saying that from the coming from the 17th to the 18th, even going into the 19th century, the condition of slaves had improved. Is that an argument for slavery or capitalism? No, it's not. And there's people out there that have actually tried to make arguments for slavery. Like if you read somebody like George Fitzhugh, he actually makes a very economic argument for slavery. And just kind of in a nutshell, it goes something to the effect of, since if people are free, or if slaves are free, and you put them to work, you pay them crappy money, and they become wage slaves, and you don't care. You just kind of like you dispense them as you see fit. But with ownership, if we own them, since we own them, then we take better care of our slaves. Now, it may be in the form of an argument, but in my opinion, it's a pretty weak argument. I totally disregard the idea of personal ownership of anybody. But overall, the idea or the context that the author is speaking in capitalism, for the most part, and to some extent, I do agree with it, but in other aspects, I disagree with it. Is part of it. I think part of it is because capitalism, in the sense that what the article is suggesting, more or less, really laissez-faire capitalism is what Ayn Rand was more of a proponent of. That's a system that people aren't ready for. It's a system that involves a lot of personal responsibility. Because remember, this is supposed to be a profit and loss system. Okay, everybody wants to profit, but nobody wants to lose. And without, let's just say, some type of socialist, if you will, aspect to like a state capitalist system as we operate under, there's a lot of things that you would have to give up. Being that the country is mostly socially democratic. I mean, most of us went to public schools growing up, all the way to things like even pension plans. Okay, these are all forms of socialism. These are all forms, believe it or not, of even welfare. So as far as the article is concerned, there's nothing wrong, particularly with the Ayn Rand philosophy, but I don't particularly accept it either. It's a very libertarian view. And the whole thing about libertarianism is one of the problems that I see with libertarianism, at least modern day libertarianism in America. It really derives, if you read up on it a bit, it derives from classical liberalism. And most people don't know what classical liberalism is. So if you tell people, well, I'm a classical liberal, they don't know what that means. And just the fact that they hear the word liberal, they think that means you're definitely to the left of things and so on. And that's not necessarily true. I would recommend going and reading some of the writings of maybe Wilhelm von Humboldt to get a better context of classical liberalism. It's not exactly what people think it is. So most of the people on libertarians, their champion is people like Adam Smith and so on, or whatever, the free hand of the market. That actually had something more or less to do with trade and stuff. Nobody will read 200 or 300 pages into The Wealth of Nations to see that even Adam Smith was against this new idea of predatory libertarianism is what you see today. So, companies or firms will say, well, rich people will say, well, you need us because we create jobs. I don't believe that either. It's more of a feedback loop. Okay, so like if I'm moving a house, if I have a house to move and I can't do it by myself, and I put an ad in paper and say, well, I need 5 people by the weekend, we'll pay $100 to help me move. Okay, and 5 people show up and I pay them after they've helped me move. Would it be fair to say that I've given them a job, or did I give them an opportunity to make money? Okay, these are two completely different things. Or if I'm a factory foreman and it's like during the 30s, during this like massive unemployment, and I come out to see who I'm going to have, where I'm going to pick work for me that day, and I skip over, let's just say you, and call on somebody next to you, would you say that he took your job or he took your opportunity to make money? Job is more, an economist may tell you that a job is more a reference to ownership, private ownership, and opportunity is more for people who are looking to make money. Since you don't have any ownership, you just have an opportunity. So, I'm trying to think what else that I can add to this to give it a little bit more color. But maybe I'll finish with this. So, like years ago, if you said libertarian, okay, that meant socialist or even anarcho-socialist, and these are terms you can look up to if you're not familiar with them to see exactly what they mean or whatever. But remember, in America, and at least in American politics, the word socialism is it's a very bad word, and it really shouldn't be. And once again, like I mentioned earlier, most people don't know exactly what socialism means. They don't know what it means by definition, and they don't understand the varied degrees of socialism or even capitalism, for that matter. And so this is why some of the foundational stuff is very, very important. So just before I finish, to jump back to the original point or part of the article when it mentioned, or even what I was talking about as far as utilitarian philosophy, a lot of the modern state or even the welfare state of democratic socialism is based off utilitarian philosophy. And you can read people like Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, and so on. And these are a lot of these principles, believe it or not, are still alive today. So I hope that helped out a little bit. I'm not sure how much it did. If you have any questions or anything like that, you can either make a video. You don't have to go that far, or you could just leave a comment in the box. And maybe I'll talk to you soon. Have a good day.